What if the pain that shaped your life wasn't the moment someone left, betrayed you, rejected you, or broke your heart? What if the pain that stayed with you the longest was something much quieter than that, something that never had a clear beginning, never announced its arrival, and never gave you a reason simple enough to explain to another person? Somehow, those are often the wounds we carry the furthest, not because they hurt more in the moment, but because they become part of the background of our lives. They settle into our thoughts so gradually that we stop noticing them, the same way we stop noticing a sound that has been playing for years. Most people think pain should be obvious. We expect it to arrive attached to an event, a breakup, a failure, a betrayal, a loss, something we can point to when someone asks what happened, something that allows the mind to create a story with a beginning and an end. But some of the most difficult emotional experiences don't work that way. They emerge slowly, hidden inside ordinary days, ordinary conversations, ordinary moments that seem insignificant at the time. Then, one day, you find yourself sitting alone, wondering why you feel exhausted despite having nothing specific to blame. Maybe that's why this particular pain is so difficult to talk about. It doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like functioning normally. You wake up, go to work, reply to messages, attend gatherings, complete responsibilities, and from the outside, everything appears stable. People assume you're okay because there is no visible crisis. Even you begin to assume you're okay because there is no obvious evidence that you're not. Yet somewhere underneath all of that movement, a strange feeling remains, a quiet sense that something important has drifted out of reach. You notice it in small moments, a conversation that somehow leaves you feeling more alone than before it started, a room full of people where you participate, smile, and contribute, yet never quite feel present. A friendship that still exists, technically, but no longer feels the way it once did. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody had a final conversation. Nobody officially left. Yet the connection slowly faded until all that remained was familiarity. And strangely, those losses can be harder to process than obvious endings because the mind keeps searching for a moment that never came. There is also the exhaustion of constantly appearing fine, not because you're intentionally hiding something, but because explaining what you feel often seems impossible. How do you describe a loneliness that appears in crowded places? How do you explain feeling disconnected from people who genuinely care about you? How do you put words to the feeling that somewhere along the way you became a version of yourself designed to function, perform, and adapt, yet somehow feel less alive than before? Perhaps that's why so many people find themselves overthinking late at night. During the day, there are distractions, responsibilities, notifications, conversations. But when the world becomes quiet, unfinished thoughts begin returning to the surface. Small memories suddenly feel heavier. Tiny disappointments seem connected to something much larger. You start remembering people you haven't thought about for years, conversations that ended awkwardly, opportunities you never took, feelings you never expressed. Not because the events themselves were life-changing, but because they seem connected to a question you haven't fully answered. The question isn't necessarily why people hurt you. It isn't even why certain things happened. The deeper question is why some experiences continue echoing long after they should have disappeared. Why certain emotions remain active years later while entire chapters of life fade away. Why so many people carry a quiet ache they struggle to describe, despite living lives that appear perfectly normal from the outside. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is that this pain is almost universal. Nearly everyone has felt it. Different circumstances, different faces, different stories. Yet the emotional experience underneath is remarkably similar. A sense that something is missing, a feeling that you are carrying a weight you cannot fully identify, a longing for connection, understanding, or wholeness that seems to remain just outside your reach. But if this experience is so common, why does it feel so personal when it happens to us? Why does it feel like something is wrong specifically with us, rather than something shared by almost everyone? That question leads us toward the deeper psychological truth hidden underneath this feeling. And in the next part, we'll begin exploring why the human mind creates this kind of pain, why it lingers for years, and why understanding it may completely change the way you see yourself. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. What makes this experience so difficult to recognize is that it rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. Most of the time, it feels practical, reasonable, even responsible. You start adjusting small parts of yourself to make life run more smoothly. You become easier to be around, easier to understand, easier to accept. At first, those adjustments seem harmless. Everyone adapts. Everyone learns when to speak and when to stay quiet. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. You become so focused on maintaining connection with the outside world that you gradually lose contact with parts of yourself. Not all at once, and not enough to trigger alarm, just enough to create a strange feeling that follows you through ordinary days. Sometimes it appears as emotional numbness, not the complete absence of feeling, but the absence of intensity. Things that once excited you now feel strangely neutral. Good news arrives, and you react appropriately. But something inside remains untouched. Achievements happen, goals are reached, plans move forward, yet the satisfaction fades almost immediately. You begin wondering whether you're becoming ungrateful, but that explanation never feels completely right. It isn't that you don't appreciate what you have. It's that your emotional connection to your own life feels weaker than it used to. You're participating in your experiences without fully inhabiting them. There are moments when this becomes impossible to ignore. You might find yourself looking at an old photograph and feeling surprised by the person staring back at you. Not because you've changed physically, but because you remember something about the way that version of you experienced the world. There was a certain immediacy, a certain presence. Even difficult moments felt vivid. Now, years later, life may objectively be more stable, yet something feels less alive. You struggle to explain what exactly has disappeared, only that some invisible distance seems to exist between you and your own experiences. What makes it even more confusing is that the habits creating this distance often look like strengths. Being agreeable, being reliable, being emotionally controlled, being the person who doesn't create problems for others. These qualities are usually praised, which means nobody questions them, including you. But occasionally, usually during moments of exhaustion, an uncomfortable realization slips through. You notice how often your first instinct is to consider everyone else's feelings before checking in with your own. You notice how quickly you dismiss your own disappointments while making space for everyone else's. You notice how frequently your internal question is not, "What do I feel?" but, "What would make this easier for everyone around me?" At some point, this pattern becomes automatic. You stop consciously deciding to adapt because adaptation becomes your default state. The strange part is that people around you may genuinely appreciate you for it. They see someone considerate, flexible, understanding. Yet, internally, another experience is unfolding. A quiet sense that nobody truly knows you because even you are becoming less familiar with yourself. Not because you're hiding intentionally, but because you've spent so long managing reactions, expectations, and relationships that your own emotional signals have become increasingly difficult to hear. This creates a kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. You can rest physically and still wake up feeling depleted. Not tired in the traditional sense, but emotionally stretched thin. Every interaction requires a little more effort than it should. Every decision feels slightly heavier. Even moments of relaxation sometimes fail to feel restorative because the mind never fully stops monitoring, adjusting, anticipating. The body is present, but some deeper part of you remains on duty. And then there are the moments that arrive without warning. A familiar song playing in a store, a message from someone you haven't spoken to in years, walking through a place that once meant something to you. Suddenly, a feeling emerges that seems larger than the moment itself. Not exactly sadness, not exactly nostalgia. Something harder to define. For a few seconds, you become aware of all the versions of yourself that existed before now. The person you hoped to become. The person you thought you would be. The person you had to be in order to survive certain chapters of life. Then the feeling passes, and you're left wondering why such ordinary moments can carry such unexpected emotional weight. Perhaps that is what makes this pain so universal. It isn't always connected to what happened to us. Sometimes it's connected to what slowly stopped happening, the conversations we no longer have, the emotions we no longer express, the parts of ourselves we no longer visit. Nothing dramatic ended, nothing visibly broke, yet something gradually faded, and because the process was so slow, we barely noticed it occurring. The unsettling question is whether these experiences are random at all. Whether this numbness, this disconnection, this quiet self-abandonment are actually separate problems or different expressions of the same hidden pattern. Because when enough of these moments are placed side by side, they begin pointing toward something difficult to ignore. Something that has been operating beneath the surface for far longer than most people realize. And in the next part, we'll begin moving closer to that possibility, because there may be a deeper psychological force underneath these experiences, one that quietly shapes how we relate to ourselves without ever announcing its presence. The uncomfortable possibility is that many of these feelings are not appearing because something is wrong with you. They may be appearing because, for a very long time, you have been living according to emotional rules you never consciously chose. Rules that felt normal because they were learned so early, repeated so often, and rewarded so consistently that they eventually stopped feeling like rules at all. They became part of your personality, part of your identity, part of the way you moved through the world. Yet, when you look closely, some of the qualities you consider most you may have started as adaptations. Perhaps that is why certain emotional patterns feel impossible to break. Not because they are stronger than you, but because they no longer feel separate from you. The person who constantly keeps the peace may not realize how often they silence themselves. The person who is always understanding may not notice how rarely they expect understanding in return. The person who never asks for much may quietly carry the belief that needing something makes them difficult, burdensome, or undeserving. After enough years, these patterns stop feeling like behaviors and start feeling like facts. One of the strangest realizations comes when you notice how much of your emotional life has been organized around avoiding discomfort rather than pursuing connection, not intentionally. Most people never wake up and decide to abandon parts of themselves. It happens in smaller ways. You hesitate before sharing what you really think because you don't want to create tension. You downplay your disappointment because someone else has it worse. You tell yourself that your feelings are not important enough to mention. The moment passes, life moves on, and nothing dramatic happens. which is exactly why the pattern survives. Every small act of self-dismissal feels insignificant by itself. Over time, however, those moments begin collecting quietly in the background. The emotional distance you feel from other people is not always created by their inability to understand you. Sometimes, it is created by how little of yourself you allow them to see. That realization can feel deeply unfair because many people spend years feeling misunderstood while never recognizing how much energy they devote to being understandable. They edit themselves before speaking. They soften their reactions. They translate their emotions into versions that feel easier for others to receive. Then they wonder why nobody seems to know who they really are. There's another contradiction hidden underneath this. Many people desperately want deeper connection, yet simultaneously fear what might happen if that connection becomes possible. Being unseen hurts, but being fully seen carries its own risk. If someone sees the disappointment, the insecurity, the confusion, the need, the anger, the uncertainty, what if they decide it is too much? What if acceptance only exists as long as certain parts remain hidden? So, a quiet compromise begins. You reveal enough to avoid isolation, but not enough to feel exposed. Enough to belong, but not enough to be known. The tragedy is that this compromise often works. It helps relationships function. It helps social situations feel smoother. It helps life remain manageable. Yet somewhere beneath the success of the strategy, another feeling slowly develops. A feeling that people are connected to a version of you rather than to you. And because the strategy appears successful from the outside, the loneliness it creates becomes difficult to explain. This is where many people begin questioning themselves. They assume the emptiness means they are ungrateful. They assume the disconnection means they are broken. They assume the exhaustion means they simply need more rest. Rarely do they consider another possibility. That perhaps the exhaustion comes from maintaining an identity that requires constant emotional effort. An identity built around being acceptable, reliable, agreeable, capable, or emotionally self-sufficient. Not because those qualities are false, but because carrying them all the time leaves very little room for being human. What makes this even harder to recognize is that emotional survival often disguises itself as maturity. Learning not to need too much. Learning not to expect too much. Learning not to ask for too much. These habits can appear wise, practical, even admirable, yet hidden inside them is a question few people ask themselves. At what point did protecting yourself become more important than knowing yourself? At what point did emotional safety quietly replace emotional honesty? Perhaps this is why certain moments affect us more than they should. A drifting friendship, an unanswered message, a conversation where we feel unexpectedly invisible. The event itself is rarely the whole story. Often it brushes against something much older, a fear that our needs create distance, a fear that vulnerability creates rejection, a fear that if we stop adapting, we may stop belonging. These fears rarely announce themselves directly. They operate quietly, shaping decisions, relationships, and identities from the background. And maybe that is the deeper pattern beginning to emerge. The pain was never only about loneliness, exhaustion, disconnection, or feeling misunderstood. Those experiences may be symptoms of something more subtle, a lifelong habit of moving away from yourself in order to stay connected to others, a habit so common that it often goes unnoticed for years. The shift begins the moment that possibility becomes visible, not solved, not healed, simply visible. Because once you start recognizing these hidden negotiations happening inside your emotional world, something changes. The experiences that once felt random begin forming a pattern. The confusion starts taking shape. And in the next part, we'll explore what becomes possible when someone stops viewing these feelings as isolated problems and begins seeing them as pieces of the same emotional story. Once these patterns become visible, something subtle begins to change. Not because the emotions disappear, and not because life suddenly makes sense, but because the story you've been telling yourself about your pain starts to feel incomplete. For years, it may have seemed like the problem was loneliness, exhaustion, disconnection, or feeling misunderstood. Those experiences were real. They still are. But now they appear less like separate struggles and more like different expressions of the same underlying movement. A gradual drifting away from yourself that happened so slowly you could hardly see it while it was occurring. What makes this realization unusual is that it doesn't arrive with certainty. It arrives with questions. You start noticing moments that previously felt insignificant. A conversation where you agreed with something you didn't fully believe. A message you spent 20 minutes rewriting so nobody could misinterpret your intentions. A disappointment you immediately minimized before allowing yourself to feel it. None of these moments seem important on their own. Yet, viewed together, they reveal a quiet habit, a tendency to manage your emotional reality before you've even had the chance to experience it honestly. Perhaps that is why some people eventually reach a point where they no longer trust their own feelings completely, not because their feelings are wrong, but because they have spent so much time editing them that the original emotion becomes difficult to find. The sadness is translated into understanding. The anger becomes patience. The hurt becomes rationalization. The need becomes independence. Over time, emotional honesty can become buried underneath emotional management. You still feel everything, but you experience those feelings through layers of interpretation before they ever reach the surface. Seen from this perspective, many of the struggles that once felt confusing begin taking on a different shape. The exhaustion is not always coming from life itself. Sometimes it comes from the effort required to remain emotionally acceptable. The fear of being misunderstood is not always about other people failing to understand you. Sometimes it emerges because you rarely allow others to see the thoughts you fear they might reject. Even loneliness begins to look different. In certain moments, the loneliness isn't created by the absence of people. It's created by the absence of emotional honesty within relationships that already exist. There is something quietly painful about recognizing how much energy can be spent protecting an identity that no longer feels entirely alive. Many people carry versions of themselves that were built during different chapters of life: the responsible one, the strong one, the easygoing one, the dependable one, the person who doesn't need much, the person who never causes trouble. These identities often begin as useful adaptations. They help relationships survive. They help life feel predictable. Yet years later, people sometimes find themselves trapped inside roles they never consciously chose to keep. And perhaps this explains why certain moments create such unexpected emotion. A drifting friendship hurts, not only because someone became distant, but because it forces you to wonder how much of yourself existed within that connection. Being overlooked in a conversation hurts, not only because nobody listened, but because a deeper fear suddenly becomes visible. The fear that parts of you have remained unseen for so long that even you have stopped looking for them. These experiences often feel larger than the situations themselves because they touch questions that have been quietly waiting underneath everyday life. The perspective shift is not realizing that you have been doing everything wrong. In fact, that conclusion often misses the point entirely. Most of these patterns developed for understandable reasons. They helped you navigate uncertainty, relationships, expectations, disappointments, and fears. They were attempts to create safety, connection, and belonging. The difficulty is not that these adaptations existed. The difficulty is that they continued operating long after they stopped being noticed. What once felt like protection gradually became a way of relating to yourself. This awareness creates an unusual kind of clarity. Not the clarity of having answers, but the clarity of seeing the shape of a question more clearly than before. You begin recognizing the difference between who you are and the strategies you learned to survive emotionally. The difference may be small at first, almost impossible to describe. Yet once you notice it, certain memories start looking different. Certain relationships start looking different. Even certain fears begin revealing things they were hiding. And maybe that is where this entire experience becomes most human, not in finding certainty, but in realizing how many people quietly carry emotional habits they mistake for personality, fears they mistake for facts, and adaptations they mistake for identity. We spend years assuming our emotional world is simply who we are, rarely considering that some parts of it may have been built in response to old circumstances that no longer exist. The strange thing is that nothing changes immediately after this realization. The friendships remain what they are. The unanswered questions remain unanswered. The moments of loneliness, overthinking, and emotional exhaustion may still appear from time to time, yet they no longer feel quite as mysterious. There is a growing sense that beneath all of these experiences, a deeper story has been unfolding all along. A story about connection, self-protection, belonging, and the quiet ways people learn to move away from themselves without ever meaning to. And perhaps that is the thought that lingers after everything else becomes quiet. Not whether you are broken, not whether you have failed, but whether some of the pain you've carried for so long was never trying to punish you at all, whether it was simply pointing towards something you had not yet fully seen. Does this sound like you? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious which part of this experience felt most familiar, and which realization stayed with you long after the video ended.